many of today's backslidings, and you might also see some of them from Indonesian point of view. They, in a way, are also counterintuitive to other developments. Like if we talk about growing technical interconnectivity, right? We have more mobility than ever, worldwide trade, very complex interdependencies in a multipolar world. So simply, we can always simply ask ourselves, why aren't we becoming better together, right? Why aren't we becoming better on a global level? So this is something I would like to keep in mind when talking about global communication, that this bad image of globalization these days, as far as I experience it and observe it, it might also have something to do with the shortcomings of global communication, and these we need to better understand. And this is also some of our prospects in the book, to scan through all layers of global communication to better understand maybe also the shortcomings and, of course, on the other side, the potentials, because this is also just to understand my own position, my personal understanding, and my own normative conviction is still that globalization remains a progressive vision, and that we need to understand the potential also of exchanges, right? And this leads in a way to this implicit layer of my talk about global communication, because I think today we also enact global communication somehow ourselves. So in this very moment, I will talk to you, and hopefully I can also invite you to share a few of your perspectives. So I think that can be a very important aspect of global communication, you know, these forms of learning from one another. So of course, at first I will share my theoretical point of view, my own observations. However, I'm really, really interested to learn from your experiences and from your perspectives as well. So therefore, that's what exchange is all about. And so Bekti mentioned it, this specific exchange has started 10 years ago, right? And when we did the project together between UNPAD Bandung and the University of Erfurt, and we thought, okay, we should compare Germany and Indonesia in terms of political and social communication and transformation, right? This was to learn from seemingly asymmetrical international comparisons. So I think our project was very much driven by this idea: how can we learn from one another if we look for, yeah, not only differences but also similarities in, let's say, political transformation, in media developments, and social and cultural communication? Because sometimes what seems to differ at first glance can be very similar on a functional equivalent level later on. And I think we stumbled across a very interesting also global developments, like how do these countries deal with the digital public sphere, for example. We discussed issues such as social media, but also populism, political communication strategies. In this sense, right, from my perspective, it is always, what can we learn from each other if we step outside our usual comparisons and our usual perspective and engage in more global dialogues. So I will talk about global communication, and actually, I hope we can also enact and do global communication in the upcoming few, yeah, minutes, hours. So maybe let's start with these paradoxical situation I already tackled upon again. And I prepared here a little slide where I ask you, yeah, what would you say? Would you agree with the fact that we live in a globalized world, or in a globally interconnected world? I assume that many of you feel that somehow we live in a global world, right? That's at least what my students usually tell me. Yeah, they feel, of course, they have their smartphones and we are very much connected with this world. And yeah, I think that is what also the early theoreticians or scholars, hyper-globalist scholars, so to say, started with, yeah, back in the days, in the millennium, so to say, around the millennium, mainly Western scholars, they envisioned this globalized world. So what they all had in common was that they all proclaimed globalization to be an almighty phenomena, right? That's where these early days of globalization theory come from. They discussed time-space distanciation, deterritorialization, the end of the nation state, right? And they assumed that we are all becoming automatically maybe more cosmopolitan if we were yeah, just interconnected instantly, also based very much on this on the technical advancements in the ICT sector. You might also have heard or came across the global village idea by McLuhan, right? We do all live in a global village. Yeah, so what we however, observed during the last, let's say, 2 decades is that these visions were probably a little too early and a little bit too well, ethnocentric maybe, and at least way too normative, right? Because reality draws a slightly different picture. So today, we know that these claims of of a global reality in which everything becomes globally connected in a seemingly automatic way, yeah, were, I would say, way too optimistic. And now we can, of course, consider empirical data and our different observations that cannot confirm these very comprehensive forms of globalization, right? So what we observe is rather also differences and frictions and worldwide experiences with global developments. And we have a lot of indicators, so to say, for limits of globalization in all areas of society, of politics, and the media, right? So to give you just a few maybe examples, when we look at society or the level of global society, right? Personal connectivity, for example, is it has accelerated and increased in numbers. However, we shouldn't forget about the fact that still 1/3 about the global population is still offline if we follow the numbers by the UN, right? So that means that 30% of this worldwide population is not really part of this connectivity we are talking about. Then if we look at the UN numbers of migration, also, yeah, although it seems an almighty phenomena these days and yeah, migration increases, however, it's still a 3.5% of the world population that lives not in a country other than where people were born in, according to the UN statistics. Plus, we need to consider also internal migration. So therefore, also this phenomena of physical cross-border experiences is not a, let's say, a comprehensive phenomena all around the world. Also, if we look at tourism, right, so physical mobility, I mean, tourism is highly unevenly distributed across the world. So only a few people from looking at the worldwide population, for example, arrive in African contexts, right? I think it made only up 5% of all tourist arrivals, whereas everyone seems to want to go to Paris, right? So there is also a huge imbalance here. And yeah, we can also ask ourselves who is really traveling across the world on an everyday level, right? So it's also very asymmetrical, we could say. And Yeah, I also found it very interesting. A couple of years ago, I came across a study on the transnational character of German society, and you might also want to look for similar studies in Indonesia. And yeah, some scholars they were interested in international contacts of German society, and they found out that only so nearly half of the Germans do not interact across borders actually on a regular level. So that means only half of the population has some kind of contact outside of Germany, which means that still many people remain locally bound, right? So they rather cross borders on a local level, but not on a global level. And if we look at social discourses, we also see, and that's maybe something you have also discussed in your courses already, of course, although there are global issues like the climate change or human rights whatsoever, we still remain in our own discursive bubbles, right? So the question is whether things like, yeah, let's say climate change are discussed in the same way at UNPAD as it is discussed as in the same way as at the University of Erfurt, right? Are we really connected, even if we are interested in the same issues, we can ask ourselves. Yeah, these are just a few indicators, right, to reflect upon when we consider the state of the art of globalization in society. And the same can be done with, yeah, observing the media. I will tackle upon that later on. But just to give you a few hints here, you might have heard of the digital divide already. I already mentioned the asymmetric axis across the world. Yeah, so do we really meet our co-present audiences worldwide if we look at the same media content, right? So there is a lot of questions. At least I usually discuss with my students that we um, don't even have a globally produced newspaper, right? So we only have a few global media like CNN, Al Jazeera English, BBC maybe comes to your mind. They're still also somehow regionally bound. That's something we can discuss later on. But what about really global media, right? I can't really imagine one of those. I mean, we have New York Times, but it's not really a global newspaper, right? Where is our global newspaper? Hey, so there are, or where is our global social media hotspot, right? So we can ask a lot of those questions. So where are the platforms where we can really and actually meet globally, right? So therefore, we usually say, okay, even the internet, which we could discuss as a global, at least platform or media or however you want to put it, remains a kind of local medium. If we look at the usage, right? If we look at the languages, for example. So yeah, in a way, it's also not really a global platform. And if you look into other forms of media regulation or press freedom or journalistic ethics, you will find that we are not at a point where we could speak of globally shared standards, right? So there might be a few universal ideas, but when it comes, for example, to cosmopolitan ethics and journalism, we have a hard time to understand and find perfect definitions for that. Yeah, so this is also some limitations if we look at the media, and we will do so later on. And also politics. I mean, I already mentioned it. Politics is usually a very global system, in diplomacy. I mean, politicians are very good at global communication by profession, so to say. However, you see these differences between, let's say, local politics and, yeah, maybe weak global governance bodies, right? They are there. However, it's still, yeah, we're still facing a world with that is very much grounded in local politics. And we see, I mentioned all the backlashes earlier. So what we can start with is that on the one hand, we have to say, okay, globalization is an unfinished and tendentious and contested phenomena, right? So it has not really, in a way, succeeded, so to say. And Professor Hafez and me, we also speak of the two-speed globalization you might came across in my book. So that we say, okay, there are globalization phenomena, but at the same time, simultaneously, we also see localization, relocalization tendencies, right? So there is a lot of difficulty to understand these dynamics that are always a little bit back and forth and parallel, right? So ambivalent, we might say. Therefore, yeah, we say, okay, one of our core arguments in the book is to say we need to better understand both the strength and weakness of global interaction, right? And to understand these developments at various levels. So it's not enough to only look at the media, for example, but we need to better understand of how all actors in society really communicate across borders, because only then we do understand that it's probably not always working at all the levels all the time, right? So sometimes you as an individual might communicate globally and you might know about the world or another place much better than do local politics, for example, or vice versa, right? So therefore, there are a lot of friction. So there are global knowledge dynamics, but on the other hand, it's also yeah, problems occurring at the same time. And this is something we want to understand more properly. Here I have a little summary about what I already told you. That's the individuals using the internet, right? These internet statistics. And as I said, we can look at it and say, wow, 70% are already interconnected or connected to the internet. But, and I think, Subekti, that's also what you are interested in, right? The use of ICT. But what about these 30%, right? Can we just forget about them? No, we need to be aware of these trends, right? And yeah, I think I already tackled upon these other elements. Well, let's yeah, have a little look here at a quote from our book. So that's maybe something we can start with, or which summarizes what I already said. So globalization is in a way an interesting vision for the future, although it still seems unfinished and it is projected into the future. And therefore, that's also why, yeah, it has become a very tendentious political term. So there are advocates and opponents of globalization. So therefore, we need to better understand it. And as it's a very contested term also. And yeah, we as media and communication scholars, of course, we look at globalization from the angle of a communication analysis, right? And I usually start with considering, well, global communication, yeah, is that really a new phenomena? So let's start with some history, right? And I brought here a picture from early human history, the paintings, cave paintings, right? And some graffiti on the other side, as we will have to deal with tempus and technocentrism in the debate. I found that very interesting because if we consider, okay, maybe just with the advent of the internet, we can speak of global communication, right? That's sometimes kind of common sense that this is a new phenomena of our time. However, I read a wonderful article by Howard Frederick about the history of long distance communication. And he goes back in time and says, That's probably a little tempocentric, right? As humans always tried to share symbols with others across time and space. So even the paint wall or the paintings at the walls in the early caves were probably messages for other groups who lived in other places at other times, right? And we can consider other forms of communication even beyond social media. We might think of early maybe smoke signs across borders, right? Or pigeons or human carriers. All the early civilizations, they had their postal services, for example, right? So there was a history of yeah, long distance or cross-border communication long before the advent of the internet. So what does that tell us? It for me, it tells us something also about the technocentrism when we discuss global communication. And what we try to do is to go beyond a mere perspective on, let's say, technical and mass mediated communication, and to integrate also other forms of communication, right? Like if we consider all forms of communication, also oral communication and text, yeah, visual signs, yeah, the debate becomes, of course, much more complex, and we can consider also different forms of communication. So that leads me to two different approaches to global communication, because there is this first one, and I try to illustrate it for you here a little bit. So we can look at global communication in technical terms. So that's the first understanding, right? So here we talk about just connectivity. So we are connected somehow as we do the same things, connectivity based on technical structures, right? So we are, we say in Germany, we are sitting in the same boat, right? So we all have our smartphones, we all do the same things somehow. Uh, so this is only one thing to highlight connectivity. However, we never yeah, know exactly what this connectivity really means or what people really do. And therefore, I think the second understanding is the one I'm much more interested in, and this is a definition that looks at it in more social terms, so highlighting the community aspect of global communication, which means to ask, what do we really do together, right? So do we steer the boat together, so to say, we are sitting in? So is there some kind of interconnection? And yeah, this leads me also to consider the etymology of communication. So I came across that and found it very interesting, as the Latin original term communicare means also to do something collectively, right? To share something with a community. So there is this, in communication, is this idea of community. So therefore, I think that's a very important characteristic. It's communication between actors who share a kind of common ground. So who belong to some kind of common social, yeah, entity, right? And therefore, we need to look at how we really interact with one another, not just, on our screens, but also directly. So this brings together a key aspect about the modes of global communication. So we probably should consider not only the mediated realm and, the internet and mass media, so the imagined world of communication, but also the non-mediated aspect. So where do people really come together and yeah, perform, so to say, their dialogues? That's why we yeah, differentiate also between mediated and non-mediated forms, although this is more a heuristic differentiation. But I hope you understand what I would like to get across, right? To not focus only on, well, our media communication might help us better understand also the shortcomings of global communication. And of course, it gets even more complicated if we consider different forms of communication, as they also have different functions. For example, texts have different functions than visuals, or oral communication has a different function than texts, right? Since, I mean, consider diplomacy, for example, it usually needs some kind of hidden oral dialogue where you can really fix problems. However, if you talk to an audience, you can't say things which which you can do in hidden encounters. So that's very interesting to dig a little deeper into these various functions of different forms of communications. But from this key aspect to consider different forms of communications, what is really important for us is this differentiation between discourse and dialogue. And maybe you stumbled across this when reading our introduction. So, what's the idea of discourse? And I try to find pictures that illustrate it very well here. So, usually, also in media and communication studies, we discuss a lot discursive communication, right? So, what do people do when they watch media, or when they actively engage with media? And this is more spreading knowledge, right? Observing others. Usually the discourse does not bring us really together. It just shares images worldwide. Whereas if you look at the second picture, of course, the dialogue is something, yeah, where we really create knowledge, right? We do not just share it and spread it, but it's about interaction, connectivity. So we really need to exchange our views, and therefore something new can probably also develop. And I think this differentiation is highly relevant for our understanding of global communication, because global communication can be, yeah, enacted by global discourses. This is when we discuss global media agendas, for example. But yeah, what is also very interesting and very relevant for building a global world and a global community, we also need dialogue, right? So let's illustrate it maybe with looking at the mass media. And here I share this picture from our book where we try to illustrate this difference. So, for example, when we take a look at the left side, the public sphere, so communication in a global public sphere, yeah, we might talk about a totally different phenomena than if we look at global dialogues, right, at the side of interaction. So let's talk about the, well, global public sphere. So what you can see here is that usually, yeah, when we consider global communication in the public sphere, we are looking at these dynamics where different national media systems look at the same events and themes, right? So we can analyze, for example, how media in Germany or media in Indonesia currently discuss the phenomena of climate change, or how you interpret the ongoing wars in the world, like the war in Gaza, for example, and you will find, yeah, differences. German media covers the war in Gaza, for sure, highly different than Indonesian media does. However, there might also be some similarities. So usually in this idea of the global public sphere, Yeah, we can ask whether there is some kind of synchronicity between these different national public spheres, right? So if we talk with the same people, if we look at the same agendas, etc., then we can maybe speak about a kind of global public sphere. However, this doesn't tell us something about the audiences who probably still stick or are stuck in their own interpretive bubbles. But that's where we usually analyze global agendas, global framing. Yeah, do we really see the world this in a similar way, right? And yeah, what we come across in our further analysis is, yeah, what is characteristic these days is well, that the media, the mass media, is yeah, still structured or still dependent on national media systems, right? And especially foreign coverage. I already mentioned it. We only rarely have global media hubs, so to say, where journalists, for example, from all around the world really work together. um, yeah, there it might be a use of international communication flows like news media agencies or foreign correspondence, as I said, imports, exports. So there is some kind of exchange, of course, going on. However, it's usually stick to these national publics. Um, yeah, so therefore, one of our observations is that there is still potential at the side of the mass media. So this is still very much domestic, right? So if we look at mass media, we look at very domestic characteristics, and usually the media is also interdependent with local politics, with economic factors, and it's also dependent on local audiences, right? So usually media addresses specific kinds of audiences, and it's only, I can only imagine rare media institutions that really have in mind a global audience, right? So many of them only have in mind maybe a rather locally or regional or linguistic audience. Does not necessarily need to be a national audience, but somehow limited based on language or a region or whatsoever. Yeah, and we can discuss, of course, the potentials we can still work on here. Somehow people say, okay, but online communication has provided us all the means to add more interaction, right, in mass mediated discourses. And of course, we've seen quite a lot of, yeah, emancipation dynamics. So there are, of course, voices that can raise or people, minority groups that can raise their voice with the help of social media, for example. So there is this democratic function on the one hand. However, what we also see today is that these platforms also lead to totally different dynamics. So do we really get into contact with others online, right? Have you found new friends online at another place in the world you've never known before, right? So there is some data indicating that also online we rather stick to our own locally defined bubbles and friendships, and we discuss, of course, a lot fragmentation and polarization. So also these, yeah, social media, yeah, in theory, it might offer ways for an alternative public sphere that can also be considered to be more global, but reality, it has not, let's say, yeah, realized in reality yet. Um, yeah, so therefore, on the other side, we need to discuss, okay, how are global dialogues to build a communicative global community are really enacted? So it needs also interaction between all social systems, the live words, and all actors in society, right? Mm. And that's maybe the key aspect too. We consider global communication not only in the mass media, but with a look at different actors in society. So, on the one hand, we can look at social systems, and on the other hand, we can look at what we call the live worldly actors, you and me, all individuals, small groups, but then also large communities. And although this is kind of simplified here, our actor-specific modes of communication, but imagine that all these actors, they have potential and limits to global communication. I already explained with the system of the mass media, right? Of course, mass media can observe so discursively very well the world. So we have journalists that, follow the news in the world, right? However, they're not that good in interaction. So even in German media, we rarely invite politicians from other European countries really to for example, show a really European debate. And I don't know about the Asian context in Indonesia, whether you have a lot of Australian or Malaysian or South Korean actors invited in your public or in your mass media discourses, right? So media is not that good in interaction, but better in observation. Also, the politics, I already mentioned it, right? Politics can observe, of course, the world in a very systematic way. That's what diplomacy does, right? However, yeah, really interaction happens usually at the level of the individual. However, we as individuals, we are very good at exchange, right? So once we meet, we can really get into deep dialogue. So that's really the potential. If people really come together, then there is the chance, if we speak the same language, that we can really share ideas and exchange about the world and build a common understanding of the world, so to say. However, we are bad at, so to say, a systematic overview of the world, right? Because you and me, we can't really follow what's going on in the world on an everyday basis and in a systematic way. We can probably only follow the one friend we have in Indonesia. I might know a little bit more about Indonesia, yeah, because we had our exchange, and Subekti might know a little bit better about Germany. However, there are so many other places I've never been to and I don't have contacts to. So therefore, it's more in an yeah, so somehow we can be very good at individuals in global communication, but not on this systematic way. And therefore, we sometimes need the media to tell us what's going on in all these other places we don't have any contact with, right? And here, I would like to share maybe the third key aspect of our in our book, and this has to do with global interdependence. Um, as all these systems and life worlds we envision in our theory are also interconnected with one another, right? So that's what I try to explain with my examples. So, of course, we can discuss if we look at us, at ourselves as individuals. Of course, what we are doing here right now is what we call a horizontal interdependence between the same actors, right? So we meet, we are individuals, and we have a little exchange on this horizontal level. So we do share our knowledge in this very moment with one another. It's in a way intergroup contact across borders, right? With the help of technology. However, I don't know if we do really share the same, let's say, images as you might have followed, your media system in Indonesia. I followed maybe. some media in Germany. And here we are also in our understanding, in a way, dependent in a vertical level, interdependent with our national media. That's what I explained before. And it's also our politics, right? Or our school system. We might learn different things about the world in our schools. So I, for example, didn't came across a lot of things about Indonesia in my curriculum, right? And I don't know whether you learned a lot about Germany in school. And so you see that, of course, our individual experiences in global communication are in a way also linked to what happens in other systems and especially in the media. And we might also follow global media, right? That's when we talk about these global vertical interdependence. So if you, as an individual, follow, let's say, Al Jazeera English or BBC, right, then it's a very interesting interdependency between different actors across borders. However, we can also ask about how, and that's what I started with earlier on, this very question, how much are how much is mass media really interconnected with one another? Does German media really follow what happens in France, for example? What happens in Indonesia? Do they include all these things? Do they even exchange news and ideas, right? Or do they stick to their own system and just observe what's going on? And there's also a very yeah, in terms of journalism, of course, it makes a difference whether I just follow the news that comes in with the help of a news agency, or whether I really discuss with my friends on the ground, right? Or if I have my colleagues on the ground, because then I'm much more at the level of global dialogue. So, and this let's say, system, so to say, makes us understand why I mean, fair enough. It's quite a complex a situation with all these vertical and horizontal interdependencies, right? And all these different actors. However, they help us to give us some kind of orientation, right? Because we are all these actors are structurally connected worldwide, and they are also communicatively connected worldwide. And so we can now zoom in and analyze different, yeah, different examples. For example, of politics, communication at the same level, right? Or, as I said, live word communication. So how do people communicate in student exchange, for example? Or we can look at yeah, different actors and ask about how do audience imagine the world based on their media experiences or their global media. I heard from Subekti that K-pop, for example, is now very much popular in Indonesia as well. So yeah, what do people do who turn to become K-pop fans worldwide? Do they interact across borders, right? Do they share the same understandings of a global phenomena? So we are co-oriented towards the same, yeah, maybe pop culture phenomena. But are we really connected? Are K-pop fans in Indonesia really connected to German K-pop fans, for example, right? That's kind of a difference, although we might follow the same pop culture phenomena. Yeah, so that's my little tour through these three key aspects of global communication. So the different forms and modes of communication, the different functions of communication, and the different actors of communication that are connected in an interdependent way. And that leads us probably to understand that, yeah, globalization, global communication is still unevenly distributed. It's still a too, yeah, speed, dynamic at several levels. There are global elites. However, there are also many domestic masses. There is some kind of global media, but there's also a lot of domestic media. And therefore, that helps us probably to give a little orientation for our analysis. And yeah, that's probably where I would like to stop for now and yeah, leave the floor for you to share questions and remarks and considerations. And therefore, I probably um, hand back to Subekti.
Thank you very much, Anna, for that really, really thorough and also interesting presentation, and explanation of your book on global communication. I think it really clears a little bit of confusion when reading the book. Perhaps some people lost in translation. Yeah, perhaps some people don't really understand the concepts that you employ, that you use in the book. And this presentation, I think, clarifies a lot of uncertainties when you read the book. And I also think it is really interesting how you picture globalization from, I would say, a realist point of view, not really too optimistic like the hyper globalists that you said, but not too pessimistic also. It is a process. I don't know if we really can achieve or realize a truly globalized world. Yeah, but and also an important point in your book that we have a different speed in globalization between systems and also life worlds. And even I think even if we sit on the same boat, like you said, in terms of connectivity, that the majority of the world of people in the world are already connected. Perhaps what kind of roles that we have is also different. As a worker, perhaps, who rowed the boat, or as the owner of the boat, or as the captain. Yeah, and I think it only means that there is always gaps and also discrepancies between people who are, who have connectivity because they have different resources, for example. Yeah. So I leave it now to the floors to students who want to pose questions to Dr. Grune. Um, Please
Yeah,
raise your hand. Or you want to comment or add
yeah,
something, please?
yeah, exactly. Because to just fill in the gap, as everyone might want to consider a question, it sometimes take a little bit of time. But what you said, I just want to have a little follow up on that
Yeah.
because you mentioned it, of course. This is not to blame individuals, for example, to not being that global, right? As we know that we do have different resources and we look at things from totally different yeah, positions. Which we need to consider and understand. However, what we discuss quite a lot here, both in our master's program, also in our research, is that we need to understand the responsibility of the systems, right, to
Yeah.
provide balanced knowledge about the world. So that's why I mentioned also the maybe the school curricula and especially the mass media, right, to provide the knowledge we need to mutually understand one another. And that's why we deal so much with the problems of yeah, sharing or reproduce stereotypes in the media. For example, there are these many yeah, subconscious stereotypes of looking at specific parts and groups in the world. And here I think it's really a responsibility of journalism, not only of course of ourselves as well, but also the systems, right? Journalism, politics, to provide this knowledge, as not everyone can yeah, can gain these experiences oneself, right?
Mm. Yeah, I think if you think about while waiting for the questions, if you think about a digital divide, for example, right, not only between countries but also within countries. Indonesia has been said we have already, I don't know, more than 80% internet penetration. Yeah, but look at the gaps between rural and also urban connectivity between men and women, between people who have, economic resources and educational differences as well. Yeah, that could lead to different speed of globalization or interactivity as well, right? I think from the realist point of view in looking at globalization, we cannot really just take for granted that globalization is happening. Yes, it's happening. Perhaps we could also look at globalization, perhaps also, decreasing in some way or another, right? And you also mentioned in your book about the system and life world and network approach. Perhaps you can explain or explore a little bit about that.
Yeah, exactly. When we started the book, we thought, okay, we should include thinking about these layers of actors, right?
Mm,
Because it's on the one hand, if we discuss systems and their interconnection, that looks very much different from that of, as I explained, the individuals, right? So as they follow different dynamics and logics.
logic.
Exactly. So a system has a different logic than we in our everyday lives. So therefore, it's an attempt to yeah, to take account of these different forms of actors. That's why we said, okay, it's a systems, a networks life world approach. And of course, there are also there is this network theory we tackle upon in the book, right? As yeah, we need to consider large communities or that are networked somehow, so they are not really individual actors in the life world. However, they're not yeah, bigger systems neither. So of course there is an interconnection between systems and life work, the actors as well. And yeah, this was our attempt to be aware of yeah, these different logics if we discuss global communication, right? To consider both systemic communication and also the live word actors and yeah, the taking care of the um, yeah, of somehow the networks without really um, only looking at everything from a network theory approach, as there are still very much organized systems and non-organized actors as well, right? So it's kind of a middle ground to position ourselves in theory here.
Mm, mm, mm. Yeah, interesting because sometimes we separate networks, with the networks and actors,
Hmm.
systems, and also life world. In your book, you said that all of the three are interconnected, and we should see then these dynamics of, interactivity and connectivity between people and systems from these standpoints, yeah, from this point of view. Mhm.
Yeah, exactly. And we struggle somehow with the understanding of mere networks like Castell's network theory, for
Mm,
example. So, I mean, of course, there are relationships between these nodes, right? However, networks are not social systems themselves and they are not individuals themselves, right? So, therefore, it's an attempt to integrate, it's an integrative theory, I would say. So, of course, we can't not consider the network approach as there are relationships and networks. However, they do not exist just alone, right? So there are still social systems and there are still life-worthy actors, so to say, and from a grassroots perspective. Yeah. And
mm,
yeah, so this is maybe our yeah attempt to integrate these layers of interconnectivity, so to say, in our theory. And we
mm,
also discuss later on, we discuss networked communities, like for example Wikipedia. I don't know how popular it still is in Indonesia, but it is maybe one of, yeah, a larger networked community across the world, right? However, if we dig a little deeper, we can analyze the individual actors acting on Wikipedia, and we can also discuss the influence of the social systems here. So it's not an entity we should only highlight. That's why we said, okay, it's our theory integrates these layers of analysis, so to say.
mm, mm, mm. Interesting. Any questions? Please raise your hand. I'm
Yeah,
sure you have prepared some questions.
and I would be highly interested in your perspective. So, what you probably experience in Indonesia in terms of, global connections, for example. Um,
Yeah. Well, you met you yeah, we have several two perhaps first Najmi and then Elora and then Azahra.
Okay, thank you so much for the buttons. My name is Najmi from Communication Management in 2024. I would like to uh, tell you some points about the Wikipedia because it was interesting because I've got some news that the government is actually trying to block Wikipedia from Indonesia. And so there's also another website, another like international known website that's been blocked here, that is Reddit. And I would like to know your perspective on that because how does an individual in certain states can explore the very can explore the world while their government is trying to like reduce the communication, uh, the global communication in the States.
Yeah, thank you very much for your observation and your question. And that very much links to what I already, or to our theoretical point of view, right? As you mentioned, of course, it started with this idea, okay, now we have all the technical tools, and therefore everyone can become a cosmopolitan, to make it very short, right? But yeah, you're actually correct, and that's what we try to investigate in more detail. So there are still national systems that control the communication channels, right? So even if have technical tools, we probably don't have the political and social environments that really allow for using these tools to the extent of global communication, right? So I actually totally agree with you. So we look at that's why we said, okay, we need to make or need to be aware and to understand better also the national interests of these national actors, for example, right? And yeah, there are so many interests involved in the digital realm. We can discuss about the monopolies of the corporate side, right? The platforms, for example, and as you mentioned it, you have governments that try to limit access, that try to limit the chance to exchange. I mean, we've seen that also in Iran, right, where internet was shut down once people took to the streets, and so there you see these, yeah, these struggles. Of interdependency, right? So on the one hand, there is a it probably also shows the potential of lively communication, right? If people connect worldwide, and you see that with specific interest groups, I mentioned several times climate issues or yeah, several human rights or feminist approaches. So there are groups of people fighting for their voice, for their human rights, for recognition, etc., or for global change, right? And so there is a strength if they connect across borders. However, and in your example, I mean, I don't know about the perfect situation in Indonesia, but following your observation, okay, that very much illustrates the strength of yeah, the social systems, the domestic social systems, right, that can still regulate communication patterns and communication flows. And yeah, so in a way, I don't know whether this answers your question, but it very well links back to our analysis, right? Um, and yeah, so therefore, maybe yeah, if you can't access Wikipedia, of course, we need to consider other platforms, other forms of yeah, um, being able to connect. But yeah, I mean, I'm looking at things from an analytical perspective, and your example helps us understand these yeah, asymmetric and ambivalent processes. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, before to Azara, I want to politely ask the audience to open their camera, perhaps, yeah, so that we can, Dr. Grune can, see your faces. Yeah, it is so more interactive communications. I think one of the aspect is, seeing your faces, even if it's mediated communication. And to add what Nazmi said about Wikipedia, recently the government also took down an investigative report from a progressive media in Indonesia about yeah, about the government. So I think it really also shows how not only in Indonesia, I think recently I read an article, even in UK, the UK government hired consultant firm to monitor social media activity of the students and also academics who post something related to pro-Palestinian movement, for example. I think it is in European countries, in a democratic country. So it relates so much into your theory how systems could, borrowing Habermasian concept, colonize the life world and also the communicative activity of the life world. So it is interesting.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly. So Bekti, that's very interesting in terms of I don't know if you've discussed it in class, this public sphere theory. So
Mhm.
to understand which kinds of actors try to limit the free exchange, right? And try to take over control of yeah, these communication platforms and channels, I'd say. And yeah, we do observe that. I mean, the USA is a good example these days with all forms of surveillance, right? And here we see that on the one hand, we had an technical invention, right? However, that goes not automatically in hand with a social process. So we might have envisioned democratic dynamics just with social media because it enacts kind of yeah, free exchange of ideas, right? So we
Yeah.
can think of it in that kind of optimistic way. However, we also see that it is the kind of use that decides upon its function. And here you see that, and we've seen that in many other instances as well in rather fragile states, for example, where yeah, governments really easily or soon learned to use these tools for their own purposes, right? And to use it for surveillance, for regulation, for even punishment, as we've known from several upheavals, like, for example, in Iran or also in
Mhm.
the Arab world with the upheaval. So that's kind of interesting if you compare these things, right? So on the one hand, yeah, new communication channels might still, yeah, have this potential. However, it hasn't been realized as too many actors make use of it in their own with their own purposes. Yeah, so they, yeah, colonize exactly the live wordly exchange, and I do agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Not to mention that also mass media have a close relationship with the political system as well in many states, many countries in the world, including Indonesia. So it leads us to the question of whether they can, realize their observational function of the mass media, right? Yeah. So yeah, Azahra, silakan.
Yeah, yeah, thank you a lot. Yeah, that's also something we discussed quite a lot. That, you know, we mentioned it that the Eurocentrism is very much characteristic also of especially the early globalization research. To my understanding, it feels as if scholars have looked at their own, you know, environments in Europe or the US, where, you know, things have changed in terms of global connectivity and yeah, of course. I mean, um, we all are dependent on our academic socialization, right? So of course, I started studying in Germany, and therefore I came across Jürgen Habermas' theory of the public sphere, right? However, I would say that our approach is somehow in the middle. So it's on the one hand, to be aware of the need to adapt these theories when it comes to looking at other areas of the world, for example, to not end up in deficits, right? Of course, it doesn't really make sense to consider a democratic public sphere theory in, for example, a non-democratic country. You will always end up with, okay, it works better here and it works worse there, right? So therefore, we need to consider, okay, what is functionally equivalent? What can the theory still tell us about other forms? And I mean, still, I think we can maybe find some common ground to discuss the very basic ideas and ask ourselves, where do people come together to discuss specific interests of common concern, right? Both in Germany as well as in Indonesia. However, we should, of course, be aware of the fact that each context has its own specific characteristics, like there are maybe different actors when it comes to religion, there are different actors and platforms when it comes to families, whatsoever, you know. So that's where we say, okay, we can't just relate every theory to another context, but need to understand the context first in order to see how the theory really can help us. And then it's this one. It's this one way, okay, to adapt, let's say, Western kind of theory or theories that has been originated in Western thought, so to say. I wouldn't go so far to say that all Western theory is useless, right? So that's the other way around, and that's why we need to be flexible. We need to adapt it. We need to be aware of, okay, also reading maybe discussions from coming from the so-called global south, if we talk about north-south comparisons, right, to include maybe thought and schools that originated somewhere else, and to see, okay, are there similarities and differences in thinking as well as in reality, right? And you mentioned the differences and the similarities, and that's something I discussed quite a lot with Dr. Subekti as well. I don't know if you remember, Subekti, in our project, that we often start with some assumption about differences, for example. However, we should also be open for similarities, right? Because often it's only after our analysis that we see there are maybe other similarities and differences, right? So we probably always need to be self-reflexive to, correct ourselves, right? Be open to correct ourselves for mutual understanding. And yeah, of course, also in our book, I think we have to struggle with the situation that also the balance of worldwide research is well uneven, right? So there is unbalanced research, since academia is very much yeah also asymmetrical across the world. So for example, when it comes to public sphere analysis, there is a lot of research on the European public sphere. That's also something we turn to in our analysis, right? And there is less research about, let's say, Asian transnational public spheres, and there is less research available on a global level on the BRICS countries, for example, right? So that's something you have to be aware of. However, we can't, of course, change the situation in a way, but being aware, it's maybe about an approach to say, okay, we are aware of our own path dependency. We try to be open and flexible and learn, right? However, it's of course, I mean, if you have a good reading a recommendation, I'm very much open to it, right? To understand maybe public spheres in Indonesia better. But yeah, that's, I mean, here also academia maybe needs more dialogue, right? That's something we discuss quite a lot also with our students. So therefore, I highly value your comment. Yeah, of course, that's an observation, a correct observation. We start from a specific standpoint, from a specific experience and orientation, and now it's maybe up to further research to open these dialogues and say, okay, what is similar, for example, in Indonesia? Do all of our observations really fit to your experience or not? Or is there something we need to adapt? And how can that inform maybe another theory, right? I don't know if that really answers your question. It's maybe not a full a justification, but that's in a way my approach, right? To be self-reflexive and yeah, open to further theoretical dialogue as well. However, yeah, as long as academia is globally imbalanced, it's not that easy to start with a global outlook, right? I
Okay,
mean,
so answer.
yeah, so back to you discussed a lot also the public sphere in Indonesia, right?
Mhm.
So these are important debates, I think. So how far can the theory travel, but where are the limits as well, and where can we learn and refine our theoretical thinking together if we take some observations from the ground? Is that so? That was always our debate, right? So how far can it travel? How can we make use of it? But on the other hand, where are alternatives? And that's what I said. Sometimes it's not that easy to find the correct alternatives, right?
Yeah, I think this is also why, direct interaction and collaboration between students, people with researchers is also important. Not only study about people, but also with people, local experts talking about their own culture, but not from the perspective of the others, right? I think that's also one of the idea that we had at the time during our project, so that we can have a perspective from both sides. I remember we illustrate that you also mentioned in your presentation that I think Indonesians know more about the German or German situations through, for example, Deutsche Welle or other German-based media that operates in the Indonesian public sphere rather than vice versa. I don't know how many in media, perhaps zero Indonesian media that available for the German public. I think almost zero. So this asymmetrical perspective on the others, I think is one of the important point to understand how globalization is also, asymmetrical in some way or another, right?
Exactly, and maybe adding to the Eurocentric perspective
Yeah.
of what has been earlier discussed, I totally agree. So to be aware of the fact that specific groups, also in the global south, so to say, are usually sometimes much more global than maybe some elites in the West, right? So that needs to be considered. And that's a general phenomena that people around the world, they follow the news in Europe or in the US, right? Much more than Europeans and US citizens really follow the news elsewhere. So that's a kind of interest. You mentioned it, and it definitely or I think it definitely links to the German-Indonesian connection. So probably you are well aware of what's going on in Europe, at least in general. However, we know that Asian the coverage of Southeast Asia is really scarce in German media. So we only rarely hear about news from Southeast Asia, right? So therefore, there might be an interesting research project to do that.
Yes.
Vice versa. Or how is Indonesia portrayed in German media, and how is Germany portrayed in Indonesian media, right?
Yes. Yes.
To understand these asymmetries better.
And that leads me to another question, Anna. I mean, if we realize that there's a deficit in discursive communication through mass media, and now we use internet and digital communication daily. I mean, to what extent then digital communication can, reduce these deficits? You mentioned also limitations of internet, of course, yeah, but could it be one of the answers, to have more interactional communication between publics?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I mean, I'm not an expert on online communication, I have to say, but actually, that's a very relevant a question. I would put it like that there still is this kind of potential. Of course, we can easily interact on social media in a dialogic way, right? However, we need to know, and so we need to know the people with whom we interact to really make it a valuable dialogue, so to say. And
Yeah.
I mean, what's the effect of a dialogue when people are not co-oriented towards the same references, towards the same issues, etc., right? So therefore, it's maybe not just a question about online communication only, but again, also about the environments, and so again, it's not just the tools, but also the maybe symbolic, imaginative resources we have to talk to one another, right? I mean, but I do agree that there is some kind of potential, because we could, in theory, we could, of course, integrate new knowledge on our own, because we are able to follow maybe alternative media elsewhere. We are able to follow different kinds of influencers or platforms or whatsoever worldwide. So on an individual level, and if you are willing to really delve into that, of course, it offers a totally new perspective, and it can even enlarge our window to the world in a way. On the other hand, that's what I mentioned earlier. We are, as individuals, of course, restricted and limited in our resources. So it would require a lot to know about all these alternative platforms, to follow them on a daily basis, right? On a structural basis. So of course there is a potential. However, we also need to consider all those limits and or limiting factors. And therefore, I think it's not that easy, as it might also overburden the individual with too much responsibility to orient oneself in this complex world. And that's a benefit, I think, of public debates, to offer some kind of co-orientation for us, right? Some co-orientation to issues. Also, I mean, the ideal free media, of course, offers an orientation in terms of yeah, balanced, correct coverage, etc. Right? So that's the idealistic idea. Not everyone needs to do it on an everyday basis, but it's organized. There is an organized platform for it. So therefore, I would sometimes I feel, if you ask me personally, I mean, I haven't considered it so far, but I'm not quite sure. Yeah, probably it would be much more interesting to really revise our global media systems, right? Restructure them, as I said, maybe work on a really idealistic global newspaper and a global media hub. I mean, even in Europe, we don't have a lot of European media that is really integrated, right? There are some examples of Arte, the German-French media corporation, right? But that's just a 1% phenomena. So really working on something, yeah, we all can co-orient to, right? Because if everyone works on their own limit, so to say, as you mentioned, we have a
Mm.
lot of fragmented publics because everyone knows a little
That's
bit,
right.
but we also need to integrate these knowledges and integrate these perspectives again on a bigger platform, right? And so that's maybe a challenge for the future. Yeah. So, of course, there is a potential for us as individuals, but on the community and society level, it requires some kind of, yeah, like a fireplace, you know, we
That's
can
right.
come together and share our stories and our knowledges.
Mm.
Otherwise, we remain little points in our own.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, sure. I think yeah, one of the reason I asked is because also our I think based on our observation, there is the differences in how we use the media in Germany and Indonesia, right? Although internet penetration perhaps higher in Germany, but we tend to use social media more rather than German audience, German public. I mean, when you say, for example, when you say newspaper corporations, and I asked the students a couple of weeks ago whether how was the last time they buy or even read newspaper. I think they rarely or even they haven't read a newspaper. So social media
Mm.
used as an information source is also one of the daily habit of media use in Indonesia, and it's different than in
Totally.
Germany.
Yeah,
Mm.
I totally agree, Zubekte, and that would be the answer my own students would say. Also in Germany, it's probably a generational dynamic here,
Yeah,
right? So growing up in a social media world, more and more young people, of course, have never seen a newspaper, right?
yeah.
It's the same with our BA students here. However, it's probably not. It's also I don't know about. Indonesia so much, but we have to differentiate here also when we talk about social media, of course, because a lot of students then say, yeah, I follow the social media account of the Tagesschau, for example,
Mm,
which is the public broadcaster in Germany. So I think, okay, they do not watch the evening news any longer in television. However, they still follow and the same broadcaster, so to say, however, in a
mm,
different channel. And therefore, it's a kind of, yeah, we need to differentiate here very much. Do you follow just old or legacy media online in your social media feed, or is it really offering something else and something new? Do you follow maybe alternative yeah, media? Like, I mean, we started here to follow alternative media influencers in the US, for example. So Midas Touch Network, for example, they share a lot of critical perspectives each day on right on their own alternative channels. And so of course it is a kind of in times of a challenged media public sphere, as you see, for example, in the US, right, where Fox News is only more and more the propagandistic channel of the Trump administration. In these instances, if we understand these kinds of structures, then it can add a perfect way for a counter public for offering resources
Yeah.
we need. However, if you have a free public sphere, so to say, in an ideal situation, it can also distract people and you know, yeah, add to a fragmentation that not always helps us to keep on our own our social dialogues, right? That's what I meant with co-orientation. So social media is probably good for alternative news and individualized news, so to say. However, it's limited in terms of offering a co-orientation for wider publics. Because if you can't even discuss with your neighbors, if you can't be sure that they have heard the same things as you have, dialogue becomes more and more difficult, right?
Yeah, I think we haven't even talked about the power of the algorithms, right? How technological affordances, could also shape the public sphere, the digital public sphere. So how these digital platforms have the power actually, to direct how the public sphere is shaped digitally. It's also another point of to discuss, right? Another questions from the students. We still have time. Please raise your hand. Do we have? Oh, Elora ya. Tadi masih ada Elora. Please, Elora.
Okay, thank you for your explanation, Dr. Anna. It's very fascinating to hear. My name is Elora, and in your book, you define globalization as connectivity and discuss the two-speed gap between global elites and local life worlds. Indonesia has various ethnic communities, such as the Baduy community, or we call it Suku Baduy. And for the context, the Baduy are an indigenous group in Banten, Indonesia, who live a super simple life and stick closely to their ancestral ways. And I recently read a 2025 study which found that the inner Baduy or Baduy Dalam explicitly reject digital technology with an 80% rejection rate to protect their ancestral traditions. It is stated in your book that a true global community requires direct interaction rather than just media observation. My question is, how do you perceive an ethnic community that chooses strategic disconnection to maintain its autonomy, its freedom? I want to hear your perspective. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, interesting question about the integration of so many diverse ethnic groups. And I think that's not only a reality in Indonesia as a very multi-ethnic country, but I mean, we can also consider India with so many different ethnic groups, but also, I mean, even Europe becomes more and more ethnically diverse, right? That's a relevant question, and it's an interesting observation that you say, okay, there are those groups who want to keep their autonomy, right? So they do not probably want to interconnect globally or online, etc. Yeah, I think, maybe my spontaneous response is that the interactive approach is very much informed formed by this idea of mutual recognition, right? So it's not, yeah, it's mutually recognizing that there are groups, that there are a lot of indigenous people that need to be considered in global debates, right? So that's probably a first starting point to say, okay, we do not envision Indonesia with only looking at, I don't know, Jakarta elites who are already connected worldwide, but to consider the many, yeah, I think, so back to your talk about centers and peripheries, right? And there are a kind of peripheries as well in other countries, right? So there is a similarity as well here. So we need to consider the integration of centers and peripheries